In 1955, an incident occurred that rocked the world of cave diving. A Navy lieutenant and his best friend ventured into the Radium Springs cave system, but he got lost unexpectedly. What happened in the following hours was devastating. Radium Springs is a small community that isn't officially a town, located just southeast of Albany in Dougherty County, Georgia, USA. It's part of the Albany metropolitan area. Radium Springs is well known because it's home to one of Georgia's 7 natural wonders. It has the largest natural spring in the state, famous for its clear blue waters. The springs produce around 70,000 gallons of water each minute, which then flows into the Flint River. Under the surface, there's a large network of underwater caves. The water contains small amounts of radium, a naturally occurring radioactive substance, which is how the place got its name. The water temperature stays steady at 68 degrees Fahrenheit all year. Before the radium in the water was discovered in 1925, the area was called Blue Springs because of the bright color of the water. In the early 1900s, many people from the north would stop here on their way to Florida to escape the winter cold. They enjoyed swimming in the springs, thinking the radium in the water had health benefits. Today, diving in Radium Springs is only allowed if you have a special permit, making it a restricted activity. Right now, the cave is not open to the general public, and only a few chosen divers are allowed to enter. These divers are mainly there for research and to gather information about the cave. Even during times when the cave is accessible, divers are usually required to turn back after exploring just a few hundred feet inside. This is because the cave is like a complicated underwater maze, which can be very risky. To help guide divers, there's a specific line set up at the entrance that they must follow. The state of Georgia has strict rules about this cave, as they consider it too dangerous for regular divers who are not trained for such conditions. This helps to prevent accidents and keeps the divers safe while exploring the cave. In the 1940s, cave diving was still a relatively unfamiliar activity for most people around the world. It wasn't yet considered a mainstream hobby, and very few had the knowledge or equipment to attempt it. It wasn't until the late 1950s and 60s that cave diving began to gain more attention in the United States. However, it was mainly taken up by those seeking adventure and willing to take on significant risks, as most people at that time viewed it as an incredibly dangerous pursuit. While there were a few instances of people diving into caves without any breathing gear, the first recorded cave dive using specialized equipment happened in 1943. This dive was conducted by Jacques Cousteau, who along with his partner invented the first open-circuit scuba gear that was commercially available. Cousteau became known as the world's first open-circuit scuba cave diver. Around this time, Lieutenant Murray Anderson, a 28-year-old with a passion for exploring underwater, was preparing for a dive in the Radium Springs cave in Georgia. Murray had a deep love for the underwater world, having logged over 200 hours of experience beneath the surface. He was not only a skilled skin diver, but also had some experience exploring caves. As a prominent member of the Macon, Georgia Skin Diving Club and a Navy frogman, he was known amongst his peers for his diving skills. For this dive into the Radium Springs cave, he was joined by his best friend and fellow diving enthusiast, electronics technician Donald Giroux, who was also a member of the club. Murray and Donald had a detailed plan for their dive on May 14, 1955. They would enter the cave together, but split up to explore different areas, hoping to map out more of the cave and increase their understanding of its layout. Both of them knew that cave diving was risky, especially in a place like Radium Springs, where the underwater passages were complex and easy to get lost in. Still, they were eager to take on the challenge. Murray was using a diving setup he had built himself, with oxygen tanks that allowed him to stay underwater for extended periods. When the time came around 6:30 p.m., They both entered the cave through a narrow 3-foot opening at the bottom of the spring. As they moved deeper into the cave, they laid a guideline to mark their path and ensure they could find their way back out. They were very careful to avoid stirring up the sediment, which could cloud the water and make it impossible to see. At first, everything seemed to go according to plan. Donald reached about 200 feet into the cave and was ready to turn back, following their safety guidelines. But Murray, feeling confident and excited, decided to keep going. With a smile on his face, he pushed through a tight opening, venturing off the main dive line they had set. Once off the line, Murray began exploring different sections of the cave, hoping to discover a new path through the maze-like tunnels. But as he dived deeper, the water around him grew murky, and the visibility quickly worsened. Frustration started to set in as he struggled to find a new route, but he didn't want to give up just yet. He decided to make one more attempt to find a new passage before turning back. Despite his growing anxiety, he pressed forward, determined to make the most of the dive. But then, everything changed in an instant. His homemade flashlight, which had been his only source of light in the pitch-black cave, suddenly went out, leaving him in complete darkness. Desperately, Murray kept swimming, hoping he might find the dive line again or recognize a familiar part of the cave. He knew that his oxygen was limited and that he needed to find his way out quickly. On the surface, Donald's concern for Murray grew with each passing minute. Murray had been underwater for over an hour, much longer than their plan allowed, and he should have resurfaced by now. As time stretched on, with no sign of his friend, a sinking feeling crept in. Something was clearly wrong. Donald paced near the water's edge, scanning the spring for any bubbles or movement that might indicate Murray's return. But there was nothing. This wasn't like Murray, who was always careful during dives. As darkness fell, Donald realized he needed to get help. He reached out to fellow members of the Macon, Georgia Skin Diving Club, who rushed to the scene. Among them were Jim Britton, a skilled diver who had shared many dives with Murray, and another diver. They arrived with urgency, well aware that time was of the essence in a situation like this. With the sun long gone, their flashlights cut through the pitch-black night as they prepared to descend into the cold waters of Radium Springs. The three men, Donald, Jim, and the unnamed diver, didn't waste a moment. They donned their gear and re-entered the Radium Springs cave, determined to find their missing friend. Despite the tension of the situation, they moved swiftly, retracing the path through the narrow entrance and into the winding passages of the cave. But conditions inside the cave were worse than they had imagined. Visibility was almost non-existent. The water was clouded with stirred-up silt and sediment, allowing them to see only a few inches in front of their masks. Still, they pressed on, following the dive line. They knew this line could lead them to where Murray had last been, and perhaps to a clue about where he had gone. The dive line ended at the 200-foot mark, where Donald had turned back earlier. Here, the three divers began their search, sweeping their flashlights back and forth in the hopes of catching a glimpse of Murray's equipment or any sign of movement. A few hours went by, and the three divers were still struggling to find anything. They kept reaching their hands out through the murky silt, but each time they came up empty-handed. Staying any longer would put their safety at risk, so with a sense of defeat, the three of them decided to turn back. All of them were worn out, but Donald had it the hardest. He was drained. When he finally made it to the surface, he barely had the strength to pull himself out of the water with all his gear. His breathing was heavy, and he looked exhausted. He had always held on to hope, but accepting defeat left him feeling completely drained. He couldn't come to terms with the fact that his best friend was gone. This had changed from a rescue mission to a recovery. A Navy team came the next day from Charleston, South Carolina, to help with the recovery. On Sunday morning, just one day after Anderson went into the cave, they prepared to go into the complicated cave system. Hundreds of people gathered at the hotel and casino above the spring, unable to believe that someone would try to explore an underwater cave. The rescue team could see very clearly, which allowed them to see several feet through the clean blue water. After 30 minutes of entering the cave, they reached the 200-foot mark, and there he was. Murray was floating near the top of the cave, completely still as if he were frozen in time, while the water flowed around him. His breathing device had slipped out of his mouth, and his flashlight was hanging next to him. The dive line was just a few feet below him. The night before, Donald and the other 2 members of the Macon Diving Club had unknowingly swum right below Anderson many times. The cave was so large and the visibility was so bad that they never noticed he was only a few feet above them, even after searching for hours. The recovery team pulled Murray out of the cave at around 8 a.m. on Monday, May 15th, so his friends and family could say their farewells. His passing caused many changes in the diving community because it was the first widely reported death in the United States. Being a 28-year-old Navy frogman also led to a push for new regulations. This event resulted in the establishment of cave diving rules, such as always using a dive line, carrying 3 flashlights, following the rule of thirds, developing advanced skills for controlling buoyancy, using special swimming methods, and knowing how to follow safety guidelines, to name a few. Training classes were also created for divers who want to learn the skills necessary for safe diving in overhead areas. Divers and aspiring divers should always keep in mind that nothing in any cave is worth risking their life for. We would like to thank you for watching this video. If you enjoyed watching, take a dive on the like and subscribe buttons and hit the bell icon so you get notified when we come back with another exciting cave diving story.